The Arizona sun was merciless that afternoon, a white-hot disk beaten down on an ocean of dust and scrub. Heat shimmered above the flat ground, blurring the horizon where red earth met a pale, washed-out sky. The land breathed in silence, broken only by the occasional creak of dry wood or the hollow rattle of a distant windmill. Eli Decker leaned against a fence post, his left knee stiff as if rusted from within. He tightened the wire around the wood, pulling hard until the barbs bit deep into his gloved hands. Sweat beaded along his forehead, mixing with the fine red dust clinging to his skin. He paused, breathing through his nose like a man who had learned to ration effort. Every movement of that left leg was calculated, measured. When he shifted his weight, he winced, the memory of a bullet from Gettysburg still living deep in the bone. He set the pliers down for a moment, flexing his fingers. Behind him stretched the small spread he called home. A dozen cattle grazing in sparse shade, 2 horses flicking their tails against the gnats, and a cabin no bigger than a freight car. The cabin sat low, its pine boards gray from years of weather. A line of smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, though there was little inside worth cooking. This was Eli's world, quiet, weather-worn, and empty enough for a man who had seen too much. Once, long ago, there had been another life. He still carried the scars of it, not just the limp, but the emptiness that followed him like a shadow. He'd left the war with more than a ruined knee. He left with a hole burned straight through his chest when the fire took his wife and boy. He never talked about it, not to the few neighbors who passed by, not to the townfolk down in Bisbee when he rode in once a month for supplies. There was nothing to say. He reached for the next coil of barbed wire, muscles pulling tight beneath his faded shirt. The sun pressed down harder, a weight on his back, but he kept working, tying off the fence. This was how he survived, by keeping his hands busy, his thoughts buried under the rhythm of sweat and labor. A man alone didn't need much more than land that stayed put and fences that held. A gust of dry wind swept across the field, carrying with it the smell of hot iron and mesquite. Somewhere high above, a vulture circled, casting a brief shadow over the corral. Eli straightened, one hand braced against the fence post as he adjusted his stance. His knee locked for a second, and he grimaced, forcing it to bend. The pain was a familiar companion, as much a part of him as the hat on his head. When the wire was finally secure, he let out a long breath and wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. His gaze drifted toward the hills in the distance, jagged and dark against the late afternoon light. That land out there wasn't forgiving. It wasn't meant for softness. Maybe that's why he stayed. He picked up the pliers and limped back toward the cabin, his boots crunching on gravel. Passing the corral, he paused to check on his mare, a chestnut with a white blaze down her nose. She nudged his hand, searching for grain, and he gave her a gentle pat on the neck. "You'll get yours," he murmured, voice low and rough from years of disuse. Inside, the cabin was as simple as the man who lived there. A single cot tucked near the window, a small table with 2 chairs, a stove blackened with soot, and shelves lined with the bare essentials: beans, coffee, a few cans of salt pork. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single photograph, its edges curled from heat. A woman smiling, holding a boy who couldn't have been more than 2. Eli's eyes lingered there for a moment. Then he looked away. Outside, the windmill squeaked, turning slow in the breeze. Eli stepped back onto the porch, rolling his shoulders. Another day behind him, another just the same waiting ahead. At least that's how it seemed. But as the sun began its slow drop behind the hills, something unsettled the quiet. A sound, faint, distant. He stopped, head tilting slightly. It wasn't the cry of an animal or the creak of wood. It was sharper, urgent, almost human. Eli froze, listening. The sound came again, faint, carried by the shifting wind. A cry,
Not a coyote's yip or the whimper of a calf. This was human. Weak, ragged, like breath torn through pain. His first instinct was to ignore it. Trouble on the frontier had a way of swallowing anyone foolish enough to chase it. He'd spent years avoiding it, and he had no reason to start now. But as he stood there, boots planted on the dusty porch, he felt a stirring deep in his chest.
That cry, it clawed at something old, something he'd buried under years of silence. With a curse under his breath, Eli stepped down from the porch and grabbed his rifle. He moved toward the hills, each step deliberate. His left knee protested with every stride, stiff and burning from the morning's labor. Still, he pressed on, following the sound. The trail was rough, loose rock and dry brush catching at his boots. Twice he had to stop and catch his breath, leaning against a boulder, the memory of Gettysburg pounding through his leg. He found the first sign of trouble at a narrow creek bed. The water had dried to a trickle, but dark stains, blood, mottled the stones. A shattered arrow lay half buried in the dirt, and a feather charm, torn from its thong, fluttered weakly in the hot breeze. Eli crouched, his knee screaming in protest. He scanned the area, muscles tightening. Whoever had been here hadn't gone far. He adjusted his grip on the rifle and followed the trail. The cry came again, closer now. Eli moved around a bend in the creek and stopped cold. There, half hidden among the reeds and rocks, lay a young woman. Her long, dark hair was tangled and dust-streaked, a single braid loosened and frayed. She was Apache. That much was clear from the beaded leather sash around her waist, now torn and soaked with blood. A deep gash ran along her upper arm, and her breathing came shallow and fast. For a long moment, Eli didn't move. Memories slammed into him, his wife's face pale with fear, his boys' cries, the fire eating their cabin alive while he'd been miles away. He'd failed them. And now here was someone else, broken and bleeding. Part of him whispered to walk away, to leave her and the trouble that surely followed. The last thing he needed was to tangle with whoever had done this. But then her eyes opened, startlingly dark, sharp even in pain, and fixed on him. There was no plea on her lips, no words of begging, just a raw, defiant will to survive. Something inside Eli shifted. He lowered the rifle, stepped closer, and crouched beside her. "You're gonna get yourself killed out here," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she understood. She tried to move, a weak hand pressing against the ground, but collapsed back with a muffled groan. Eli scanned the hills. Whoever attacked her could still be nearby. There wasn't time to think. He slid the rifle onto his back and leaned down. "All right," he said softly, "I've got you." The moment he lifted her, pain shot through his leg like fire. She was light, far lighter than she should have been, but his bad knee screamed with every step. He gritted his teeth and forced himself onward, adjusting her weight against his chest. Her breath warmed his collarbone, and for a moment he thought he felt her fingers clutch weakly at his shirt. The walk back to the cabin was a battle in itself. The ground seemed to stretch, every yard longer than the last. Twice he nearly stumbled, his knee threatening to give out, but he tightened his grip and kept moving. By the time he reached the porch, sweat dripped from his brow and ran into his eyes. He kicked the door open with his heel, stepped inside, and lowered her gently onto his cot. For a long while, Eli just stood there, catching his breath. The desert sun was sinking behind the hills, casting the cabin in gold and shadow. Something told him his life had just shifted, though he didn't yet know how or why. Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. The cabin smelled of dust, smoke, and the faint metallic tang of old blood.
Eli set the young woman down on his cot, the thin mattress sagging under her light weight. She was still conscious, but barely. Her dark eyes followed him in a guarded way, as if every breath she took might be her last. Eli knelt beside her, testing his knee with a sharp hiss as pain shot through his leg. He grabbed a tin basin from the shelf, filled it with water from the jug, and placed it on the table. His hands were rough and calloused, but his movements were deliberate, careful. He didn't speak, not yet. He'd seen enough wounded souls to know words came last. The gash on her arm was angry and swollen, the blood dried in dark streaks against her skin. He rolled up his sleeves, found an old strip of linen, and dipped it in the water. She flinched the moment the wet cloth touched her wound. Her lips tightened, but no sound came out. "Easy," Eli muttered, voice low and rough, as if he hadn't spoken for days.
"Ain't here to hurt you." She didn't understand his words. Or maybe she did, but didn't believe them. Her eyes narrowed, sharp as a hawk's. He kept working anyway, dabbing away the blood, cleaning dirt from the wound. Each time she jerked back, he gave her space, letting her see his hands, open and steady. He'd done this before, back in the war, patching men who didn't always make it to morning. Her skin burned with fever. Without treatment, she wouldn't last the night. He reached for a small bottle of whiskey, what little he had left, and poured some over the cut. She sucked in a sharp breath, fists clenching against the cot, but she didn't cry out. There was strength in her, raw and unyielding, even when pain racked her body. Eli worked in silence, wrapping the linen around her arm, tying it tight but not cruel. When he was done, he sat back, his knee throbbing from crouching too long. He stared at her for a moment, seeing more than just a wounded stranger. She was young, maybe 20, but her eyes held something older: loss, fire, defiance. She shifted slightly on the bed, murmuring something in Apache, words that rolled soft but strong from her lips.
Eli didn't understand, but he caught the edge of her tone, a question, maybe a warning. He shook his head slowly. "Don't know what you're saying, girl, but you're safe here, for now." He stood and fetched a wooden bowl from the shelf. Beans, cold and bland, but food nonetheless. He set it beside her, along with a tin cup of water. She looked at them, then at him, suspicion flickering across her face. Eli didn't force her. He simply stepped back, resting his weight against the doorframe. "Eat if you want," he said quietly, "or don't. Makes no difference to me." Her gaze lingered on him, as if trying to read the truth behind his words. After a long silence, she reached for the cup. Her hand trembled slightly, but she managed to lift it to her lips. Eli watched for a moment, then turned and stepped outside. The late evening air was cooler now, the sun sinking into the horizon. He leaned against the porch rail, the ache in his knee sharp but tolerable. Somewhere out there, whoever had done this to her was still moving, maybe watching. Inside, the young Apache girl, Ayanna, though he didn't yet know her name, took a slow, cautious sip of water.
The man who had carried her here hadn't spoken much, hadn't looked at her with pity or greed. And for reasons she couldn't name, that unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. By the second day, Ayanna had managed to sit up on the cot, though her arm was still bandaged and stiff. She hadn't said a word to Eli, except for a few murmurs in Apache when she thought he wasn't listening. He didn't press her. Instead, he went about his work with the same slow, deliberate rhythm as always, feeding the horses, stacking firewood, repairing tools that weren't quite broken. Eli was careful with her space. He didn't hover or stare, just left food and water near her bedside and stepped outside when she ate. If she wanted to keep her silence, he'd let her. He'd learned long ago that people talked when they were ready, and not a moment sooner. But Ayanna noticed him. She watched the way he handled his horses. Soft hands, quiet voice, never jerking the reins. He brushed the mare's coat with a patience that made her ears tilt in trust.
Even the cattle, stubborn and restless, seemed calmer when he was near. There was no cruelty in his movements, no need to show strength by force. That evening, as the sun bled red across the hills, Eli came back from the barn carrying an oil lantern. A coyote had wandered close to the chicken coop, drawn by the scent of feed. He didn't grab the rifle. Instead, he picked up a rock and hurled it just past the animal, the sound cracking through the quiet. The coyote bolted into the brush unharmed. Ayanna saw all of it through the open window. Something softened in her gaze, just a fraction, but enough. She'd seen men kill for less, men who shot first just to prove they weren't afraid. This one didn't waste bullets on things that weren't necessary. Later that night, Eli brought in a pot of beans and cornbread. He placed a bowl on the table beside her and sat across the room, eating his own portion in silence. Ayanna glanced at him, then at the food, and finally picked up a spoon. After a few bites, her voice broke the quiet. It was little more than a whisper, her English halting and accented. Ayanna." Eli looked up from his plate, brow furrowed. "What?" She touched her chest lightly, the gesture deliberate. "Ayanna," she repeated, the name flowing like a song. He nodded slowly. "Ayanna." He set down his spoon. "Eli." Eli Decker. For the first time, her eyes met his without the shadow of fear. A small nod passed between them, as if sharing their names was an unspoken truce. The next morning, when Eli stepped outside to check the water trough, he noticed something unexpected. The blanket on the cot had been folded neatly, and the bowl from last night had been cleaned and placed back on the shelf. Ayanna was sitting upright, combing through her tangled hair with a broken wooden comb. "You don't have to do that," Eli said gruffly, stepping inside. She looked at him, a hint of challenge in her dark eyes. "Help," she said simply, tapping her chest. Eli stared for a moment, then gave a single nod. "All right, help if you want." He went back to work, but something had shifted. She wasn't just a wounded stranger anymore. She'd chosen to stay awake, to see what kind of man he was. That evening, as the sky dimmed to purple, Eli caught her watching him as he mended a loose saddle strap. "You'll need rest," he said, testing the leather with his calloused fingers. Ayanna tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile in her eyes. "Rest later," she replied, her English broken but clear. It was the first time Eli had heard her voice carry a note of strength instead of fear, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it settled something restless in his chest. The third morning broke cool, with a gray-blue mist clinging low over the ranch. Eli rose early, as always, though his knee ached worse than usual after mending the fence posts the previous night. He sat on the porch, rubbing the joint absent-mindedly while nursing a cup of bitter coffee. Inside, Ayanna was awake, her silhouette faint through the cabin window. When Eli stepped back inside, he found her sorting dried beans on the table. Her arm was still bandaged, but she moved with quiet determination, separating the clean ones from the cracked with delicate, sure fingers. She didn't look up when he entered, though he noticed the faint outline of a wooden comb on the table, the same one he'd seen her trying to untangle her hair with the night before. One side of the comb's teeth was broken, splintered from years of use. Eli picked it up, turning it in his hands. It was handmade, the kind of thing someone carved with care. Ayanna froze, watching him closely, her dark eyes alert as if she expected him to take it away.
Instead, he sat down on the edge of the table, pulled out his small pocket knife, and began shaving a new tooth where the comb had broken. His movements were slow but precise, the same patience he used when fixing old leather straps. Ayanna's gaze softened as she realized what he was doing. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. After a long silence, she said a word in Apache, her tone low and reverent.
Eli glanced at her, not understanding but sensing its meaning. "Thank you." He set the comb down once it was mended and slid it back toward her. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it'll hold." Ayanna picked it up, fingers brushing the repaired edge. "Good," she murmured in broken English. Then she added, "Father, make." She tapped the comb and then her chest, her voice carrying a note of sorrow. Eli understood enough. Her father had made it. "Your father," he said gently, "is he—" He didn't finish the question. Her eyes dropped to the table, lashes heavy with shadow. "Gone," she whispered, her voice trembling between English and Apache. "Village, burned, men with guns." Eli's chest tightened. He'd seen villages like that before, burned to the ground, the earth scarred with cruelty. He swallowed, setting down his coffee. "I'm sorry," he said, and for once the words didn't feel hollow. Ayanna looked at him, as if studying his face for a trace of pity. She found none, only a quiet, weary understanding. She pointed to his leg, where the old injury made every movement deliberate. "War?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Gettysburg, a long time ago." His voice grew distant, like he was speaking to someone who wasn't there. "Took a bullet through the knee. I lived, but my family didn't." He stared out the window, the red dirt beyond it glowing faintly under the morning sun. "House burned while I was away. My wife, my boy, they didn't make it." Ayanna didn't speak for a long time. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing the edge of the table. Her fingers didn't touch his, but the gesture was enough, a silent acknowledgement that pain had carved deep lines through both their lives. That evening, as Eli worked to tighten the saddle on his mare, Ayanna wheeled herself closer to the door. She pointed at the saddle strap. "Loose," she said, her tone hesitant but trying. Eli looked over his shoulder, a faint smile in his tired eyes. "You've got a sharp eye," he replied. By nightfall, Ayanna was peeling beans while humming something soft and low in her native tongue. Eli sat across from her, listening quietly. He didn't know the song, but its mournful melody felt like the echo of a past they both carried, broken but still alive. The desert sky stretched wide and empty the following morning, but Eli sensed a shift in the air, something taut and unsettled. While repairing a broken latch on the barn door, he paused, scanning the horizon. A faint line of dust curled far to the west, rising in a way that didn't belong to the wind. By midday, he spotted them through the glass of his old spyglass. 3 riders moving slow but deliberate, like wolves stalking the edges of the land. He lowered the scope, his jaw tightening. Whoever they were, they weren't passing travelers. Later, when he rode into Bisbee for salt and kerosene, the whispers began before he stepped off his horse. 2 townsmen were talking outside the trading post, their voices sharp and low. "Jonas Creed's in these parts again," one muttered. "Him and that pack of ex-soldiers. Heard they've been hunting a girl, Apache, young, might be a bounty." "Creed," Eli repeated under his breath, the name sour on his tongue. He knew the man, or at least the type. Jonas Creed had once worn the Union blue, but after the war, men like him traded loyalty for gold, drifting through the frontier like scavengers. Creed was known for his scarred jaw, a deep gash running from ear to chin, and the cold glint in his eyes. Eli kept his business quick. He bought what he needed and left, ignoring the looks from the townsfolk who always wondered why he stayed so far out. As he mounted his horse, a young stable hand whispered, "Mister, you best be careful. Creed's been asking about a ranch out this way. Said someone's hiding what's his." Eli didn't answer, but his stomach knotted. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun had dipped low, turning the desert gold and blood red. He found Ayanna sitting on the porch, carefully weaving a thin strand of leather, her face calm, but her eyes sharp as always. "You see anyone out there?" he asked. She looked at him, sensing the weight in his voice. "Who?" "Men," Eli replied. "Not good men. They'll be coming." Ayanna tensed, her fingers pausing on the leather strand. "Creed," she said quietly, pronouncing the name with a mixture of fear and anger. It wasn't a guess, it was recognition. Eli's brows furrowed. "You know him?" Her jaw tightened. Take people. Kill." Her English stumbled, but the meaning was clear. Jonas Creed's men had been part of the attack on her village. Eli walked to the barn, his limp more pronounced as he gathered his rifle and checked the rounds. The weapon was old but well maintained. He'd sworn years ago he'd never pick it up again unless there was no other choice. That time had come. As night settled over the ranch, Eli set a lantern near the window and loaded shells by the table. Ayanna watched him, her gaze unwavering. "You stay inside," he said. She shook her head. "If they come, I fight." Eli's eyes met hers, a flicker of respect passing between them. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," he said. Outside, the desert was dark and still, but Eli knew the quiet wouldn't last. Somewhere out there, Jonas Creed was moving closer, and men like him didn't knock on doors, they tore them down. The next few days passed like the tense lull before a storm. Eli's ranch, once defined by its quiet solitude, now felt heavy with anticipation. Each creak of the windmill, each rustle of mesquite in the night set him on edge. He oiled his rifle twice, not because it needed it, but because his hands needed something to do. Ayanna sensed it too. Though she said little, her eyes tracked every sound outside, every flicker of movement beyond the corral. She had begun to move more freely now, her wound healing under his careful bandages and a mixture of herbs she had prepared herself. That morning, Eli found her crouched near the garden bed, grinding something with a small stone mortar. A faint, earthy scent rose from the crushed leaves. "What's that?" he asked, limping over. "For you," she said simply, pointing to his knee. "Pain go down, Apache medicine." Eli tilted his head. He wasn't one for fancy cures, but when she pressed the warm poultice against his knee, he felt a subtle heat seep into the joint. For the first time in days, the stiffness eased. "Not bad," he muttered, and Ayanna allowed the faintest trace of a smile. Later, they sat on the porch while the late sun painted the desert in shades of fire. Ayanna spoke slowly, halting between English and Apache words, but Eli listened with patience. Bit by bit, she revealed more of why Jonas Creed wanted her. From beneath her blanket, she pulled out a wampum belt, its beadwork intricate and gleaming faintly in the sunset. "This," she said, holding it up, "belonged to my father, tribal leader. Creed wants land. Belt is proof, our word." Eli leaned forward, studying the beads. He'd never understood the politics between settlers and tribes, but he knew the look of power when he saw it. If Creed gets his hands on that, he can do a lot worse than burn villages. Ayanna nodded. "He kill, take, always take." The words hung in the air, heavy as desert heat. Eli sighed, rubbing his jaw. "You staying here makes you a target, you know that." Her gaze didn't waver. "Safer than running alone. You, good man." He shook his head. "Not so sure about that." "You help," she replied, tapping the bandage on her arm. "Most men would leave me." He didn't answer. Deep down, he knew she was right. But it wasn't goodness that drove him. It was something quieter, something like redemption. That evening, as Eli worked to secure the barn door, Ayanna joined him, handing him nails from a small tin. It wasn't much, but the act of working side by side felt strangely grounding. "Creed's coming," Eli said finally, breaking the silence. Ayanna tightened her grip on the nail she held. "Then we fight."
Eli looked at her, the desert twilight cutting sharp lines across his face. "You sure about that? It'll get ugly." She nodded once, calm but firm. As night fell, they shared a meal of cornbread and dried meat. There wasn't much talking, but the silence no longer felt like a wall. It was a quiet understanding, the kind forged by people who had already lost too much and had no illusions about what was coming. When Eli stepped out to check the horizon one last time, Ayanna sat by the window, fingers brushing over the beads of the wampum belt like a prayer. Out there, the desert was still. But he knew Jonas Creed wouldn't let it stay that way for long. The night came heavy and black, the moon swallowed by drifting clouds. Eli sat by the window, rifle propped against the sill, listening to the wind scrape against the wooden boards of the house. His gut told him it wouldn't be long. Men like Jonas Creed preferred the dark. It gave them the advantage of fear. Ayanna slept lightly, curled in the corner near the hearth. Her breathing was soft, but her hand rested close to a knife Eli had given her earlier. It wasn't much, just a small hunting blade, but she held it as if it were an extension of her will. The first sign came just after midnight, the sound of horses. Not the steady pace of travelers, but the slow, deliberate movement of men approaching with caution. Eli's body went rigid. He rose without a word, the limp in his knee worse in the cold night air. He touched Ayanna's shoulder lightly, and her eyes snapped open. She needed no explanation. "Barn," Eli whispered. "They'll try to flush us out." She nodded, her gaze sharp as flint. Then it came, a sudden whoosh of flame and a roar of heat. Through the window, Eli saw the barn ignite, fire crawling across dry hay and wood like a hungry beast. Creed's men had struck fast, setting it ablaze to drive them into the open. Eli grabbed the rifle and moved to the door. "Stay low," he muttered. A shadow moved outside. Ayanna followed his signal, crouching near the floor, as Eli kicked the door open and fired a warning shot into the night. The bullet cracked against the desert silence, and one of the attackers cursed, ducking behind a corral post. Another shadow flanked left, and Eli took aim, his old military instincts snapping into place. He squeezed the trigger, one shot, clean and deliberate, and the figure dropped. But there were more. "Go for the back," he barked at Ayanna, pointing toward the rear of the cabin. She moved quickly, surprising him with her swiftness despite her healing wound. She grabbed the water bucket and threw it over the steps, trying to stop sparks from catching on the porch. The fire from the barn roared higher, illuminating the night like a false dawn. Eli felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from fury. That barn had stood since before the war. He'd built it with his own hands, board by board, and now it was burning. A shot rang out, splintering the doorframe near his head. Eli ducked, returning fire. The sound of horses pulling back suggested he'd hit close enough to scare them off, at least for a moment. But the flames wouldn't wait. He limped toward the barn, ignoring the protest in his knee. The heat was brutal, scalding his face as he tried to free the horses. Ayanna was suddenly beside him, covering her mouth with a wet cloth, eyes squinting against the smoke. Together they managed to unbolt the gate, releasing the terrified animals. 2 horses bolted into the dark, while one stumbled but made it out alive. By the time the last attacker fled into the desert, the barn was little more than a blackened frame, glowing like coals against the night. Eli dropped onto the porch steps, chest heaving. His knee throbbed violently. And when Ayanna crouched beside him, he saw her glance at the blood soaking through his pant leg. A stray bullet had grazed him. She didn't speak, only tore a strip from her blanket and bound his wound with swift, sure hands. Her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes burned like the fire they'd just fought. "They'll come again," Eli said hoarsely, looking out into the dark. "Next time, they'll bring more." Ayanna nodded, her jaw set. Then we be ready." The ground there rose unevenly, cut by sharp outcroppings of red rock and dry gulches. It was a place Eli knew well. He'd hunted coyotes and fixed fence posts along these trails, but never looked at the land as a battlefield until now. "Here," Ayanna said, pointing to a narrow pass where the canyon walls pressed tight like a funnel. "They come through, we trap." Eli studied the terrain, his soldier's mind reawakening old instincts. He could almost hear the echoes of war, the snap of musket fire, the barked orders, the chaos. He shook it off. This wasn't Tennessee, but the strategy was the same. "We can roll logs down from here," he said, marking a spot high on the ridge. "They'll have nowhere to go but forward, or straight into our fire." Ayanna crouched, drawing symbols into the dust with a stick. Lines for movement, circles for ambush points. "I take high ground, bow, fast and quiet." Eli glanced at her, impressed. "You ever been in a fight like this?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "My people always fight to survive. I will not hide." There was a silence between them then, not of doubt, but of respect. Eli saw in her something that reminded him of himself years ago, a refusal to give in. "Then we make them regret stepping foot on this land," he said. The sun climbed high, relentless and white-hot, but Eli and Ayanna worked without pause. The canyon would be their battlefield, and every rock, log, and patch of dry brush would play its part. Eli hauled heavy logs up a narrow incline, his bad knee straining with each step. Sweat rolled down his back, soaking his shirt, but he didn't stop. At the ridge, he positioned the logs, tying them together with thick rope salvaged from the remains of his barn. One quick tug and they'd crash down, blocking the canyon's only escape route. Below, Ayanna arranged piles of dry mesquite and juniper branches. She rubbed 2 stones together, testing the spark. "Smoke," she explained simply. "Creed's men cannot see, cannot shoot." Eli gave a faint grin. "I like the way you think." She didn't smile back. She was focused, deliberate. Her movements were sharp, almost ceremonial, as if this preparation was not just strategy, but ritual. When the traps were set, Eli took a moment to breathe, scanning the canyon with a soldier's eye. The place felt alive now, primed and waiting, like a coiled snake ready to strike. He imagined Creed's men swaggering in, laughing, thinking they had the upper hand. They wouldn't be laughing for long. While Eli checked the rifle sights, Ayanna climbed a ledge and crouched low, bow in hand. She knocked an arrow and aimed at a distant cactus, releasing it with a clean snap. The arrow struck dead center, quivering in place. Eli raised an eyebrow. "That's a shot." "My father taught me," she said, her voice carrying both pride and a hint of sorrow. "Before the soldiers came." Eli nodded, the weight of her words pressing on him. He'd be proud. They spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing the plan. Eli marked firing zones on the dirt, showing Ayanna where to strike first. "Hit their lead rider," he said. "Throw them into chaos. I'll cover the rest." By sunset, they returned to camp. The canyon loomed silent behind them, ready for blood. That night, they sat by a small fire. Neither spoke for a long time. Eli stared into the flames, lost in memories of war, marching under rain, the screams, the smoke. He clenched his jaw, forcing the thoughts back. Ayanna's voice broke the silence. "You fight for them?" He looked at her. "I fight for what's right." She studied him a moment, then nodded. In the firelight, their shadows leaned closer, as if acknowledging that for this battle they were no longer alone. The morning came sharp and clear. The sky painted a cruel blue that belied the violence brewing beneath it.
Far out on the horizon, a dark smudge of dust rose against the sunlight. Riders. Eli spotted them first, his eyes narrowing as he leaned on the fence post near the corral. "They're coming," he muttered. Ayanna joined him, her expression unreadable. Her fingers tightened around the bow slung across her shoulder. "How many?" "7, maybe 8, he said. "Creed's with them. I can feel it." They mounted their horses and rode up the narrow trail leading to the canyon, the traps waiting like silent sentinels. From their vantage point high on the ridge, they watched Jonas Creed and his men ride in. Creed was unmistakable, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved by violence. A jagged scar split across his left cheek, pulling his lip into a permanent sneer. His black hat was tilted low, but his eyes gleamed like cold steel.
"Spread out," Creed barked, his voice carrying up the canyon walls. "She's close. That Apache girl's worth more than a gold vein if we play this right." The men laughed, their words dripping with mockery. One of them held up a string of broken feathers they had taken from an abandoned Apache camp. "Maybe we'll smoke her out like the rest of 'em," he jeered, tossing the feathers into the dirt. Ayanna's jaw tightened, her breath slow but furious. Eli placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Not yet," he whispered. Creed dismounted and kicked at the ashes of a burned-out hut along the canyon floor. He crouched, sniffing the air as though he could smell his prey. "She's here," he growled. "I want her alive. The old man, too, if he doesn't fight too hard. Otherwise—" He let the sentence hang, and the men grinned wickedly. From above, Eli studied their positions. They were confident. Too confident. Their formation was loose, some of them laughing as they lit cigars. Perfect. "We wait for the signal," Eli whispered. Ayanna nodded, her fingers resting lightly on the string of her bow. Creed mounted his horse again, oblivious to the trap closing around him. "We'll ride through that canyon, flush 'em out like rats," he said. Eli's voice was low but certain. "Let them come." The first horse crossed the narrow pass just as the sun broke over the ridge, painting the canyon walls in streaks of crimson. Eli crouched low behind a boulder, his rifle pressed against his shoulder, every muscle coiled like a spring. Above him, Ayanna waited on a rocky ledge, bow drawn, eyes like sharp points of obsidian. Creed and his men entered the canyon single file, their laughter echoing between the stone walls. They thought they owned the land, their arrogance filling the silence like poison. Eli gave a quick nod. Ayanna released her first arrow. The shaft flew with a hiss, striking the lead rider's horse in the flank. The animal reared, throwing the man off and sending chaos rippling through the group. "Ambush!" one of them shouted, fumbling for his revolver. Before they could regroup, Eli yanked the rope he'd set earlier. With a thunderous crash, the logs he'd rigged tumbled down the slope, smashing into the canyon floor and blocking their escape route. Dust rose in choking clouds, mixing with the startled shouts of Creed's men. "Find them!" Creed roared, drawing his pistol and firing blindly toward the ridges. Eli squeezed the trigger of his rifle, once, twice, each shot deliberate. One man dropped, clutching his shoulder. Another ducked behind a fallen log, cursing. Smoke began to fill the canyon as Ayanna lit the piles of dried brush they'd arranged the day before. The flames crackled, sending up thick, acrid plumes that blurred sightlines and turned the men's advantage into confusion. "They can't see!" one of the riders yelled, hacking through the smoke. Ayanna moved like a wraith, sliding from one rocky perch to another, loosing arrows with precision. Her dark hair whipped around her face, her silhouette ghost-like against the haze. Eli covered her from below, his limp slowing him but not his aim.
He fired at the men trying to climb the canyon walls, each shot forcing them back. The sound of gunfire and snapping arrows echoed like rolling thunder. One attacker managed to flank Eli, lunging from the side with a knife. Eli turned too late, his bad knee buckled. For a split second, it seemed he'd be overpowered. But Ayana's arrow struck the man's arm, forcing him to drop the blade. Eli gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, nodding toward her. She gave a sharp nod back, her face fierce and unshaken. The battle was just beginning, but they had the upper hand. The canyon floor was littered with smoke, fallen men, and frightened horses. Most of Creed's gang had scattered or lay wounded, but Jonas Creed himself was still standing, his revolver drawn and his face twisted with rage. "Decker!" Creed's voice boomed through the haze. "Come out, you coward! You think you can hide behind rocks and tricks." Eli's breathing was heavy, his knee throbbing, but he stepped out from behind cover, rifle leveled. "This is where it ends, Creed. You picked the wrong land, the wrong people." Creed grinned, a feral flash of teeth. "You and that Apache girl, you think you can stop me?" Ayana shifted on her ledge, arrow ready, but Eli raised his hand slightly, signaling her to hold. This was his fight. Creed fired first, the bullet whistling past Eli's shoulder. Eli fired back, forcing Creed to duck behind a boulder. The air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, each shot echoing like the drumbeat of war. Eli's knee buckled as he moved, pain shooting up his leg. He stumbled, and Creed seized the moment. With a roar, Creed charged, slamming into Eli and knocking the rifle from his grip. They crashed to the ground, dust billowing around them. Creed's strength was brutal. He pinned Eli with one arm, the other raising a knife. "This is it, old man," Creed snarled, pressing the blade closer. Eli's muscles strained, his breath coming in short bursts. For a moment, it seemed he would lose. His knee gave no leverage, and Creed's weight crushed him. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Eli!" Ayana's cry was sharp as she loosed an arrow, the shaft striking Creed's shoulder. He howled, stumbling back just long enough for Eli to roll free. Gritting his teeth, Eli grabbed the revolver lying in the dirt. Creed lunged again, knife raised high. "Not today," Eli growled. He pulled the trigger. The shot hit Creed square in the chest. Creed's face twisted in shock, then his body crumpled to the ground. The canyon fell silent, save for the crackle of dying fires. Eli stood over Creed's body, chest heaving. Ayana approached slowly, her bow still in hand, eyes locked on the fallen man. "It's done," Eli said, voice low but steady.
Ayana nodded, her expression unreadable, but the fire in her eyes softened just a little. The canyon was quiet now, its silence broken only by the distant caw of a crow circling above. Smoke drifted from the smoldering brush piles, curling into the pale blue sky. The ground was littered with spent shells, broken arrows, and the faint scent of blood. Eli leaned against a boulder, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. His knee throbbed violently, every nerve screaming from the fight, but he remained standing, refusing to show weakness. Ayana moved toward him, bow still in hand, her hair tangled and streaked with ash. "You're hurt," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "Just tired," he replied, though his face betrayed the pain. He holstered his revolver and looked around the battlefield. Only 3 of Creed's men were left alive, fleeing with whatever horses they could manage. The rest lay still on the canyon floor, the echoes of their arrogance gone with them. Ayana reached into her pouch and pulled out a small leather strap adorned with beads and feathers, a sacred Apache charm. She tied it gently around Eli's wrist, her fingers brushing his skin with deliberate care. "What's this?" he asked, his voice rough. "Strength," she whispered, "for warriors who fight not for themselves, but for others." Eli looked down at the charm, then at her. For a moment words failed him. Instead, he gave a small nod, his gaze steady and unspoken gratitude clear in his eyes. They gathered what they could from the abandoned supplies, ammunition, food, blankets, and loaded them onto a surviving horse. As the sun sank toward the horizon, its golden light flooding the canyon, Eli and Ayana walked side by side back toward the ranch. At the top of the ridge, Ayana paused and glanced back at the battlefield. "It's over," she said quietly, as if convincing herself. Eli adjusted the rifle on his shoulder. "For now, but they won't be back, not after this." When they reached the ranch, the blackened remains of the barn stood as a stark reminder of the price they had paid. Eli limped to the porch, dropping heavily onto the steps. Ayana sat beside him, the silence between them not empty, but full of something unspoken. Respect, trust, maybe even hope.
"You fought like someone who's not ready to give up," Ayana said. Eli glanced at her, a faint smile breaking the stoicism of his face. "Maybe I'm not. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey." The days after the battle unfolded slowly, as if the land itself needed time to breathe again. The canyon was silent now, the echoes of gunfire long gone. Back at the ranch, Eli Decker began the work of rebuilding, one board, one nail at a time. His knee ached constantly, stiff and swollen from both the old wound and the fight with Creed. But he pushed through the pain, leaning on a cane he'd carved from mesquite wood. Ayana was always nearby, silent but steady, helping in ways that didn't draw attention to her own scars. She sorted the salvageable supplies they'd taken from Creed's men, ammunition, blankets, sacks of grain, and stored them neatly in what remained of the barn's shadow. What they couldn't save, she burned, as if cleansing the place of its ghosts. One afternoon, Eli paused from lifting planks to watch her in the garden. She had cleared a small patch of land near the porch, planting beans and herbs in neat rows. Her hands were quick and confident, pressing seeds into the warm earth. "You ever done this before?" Eli asked, leaning against the fence. Ayana looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "My mother taught me. She said the land gives back if you show it care." Eli's eyes softened. He hadn't heard words like that in a long time. Your mother was right. For a while, the two of them worked in companionable silence, the kind that felt almost like a conversation of its own. At night, they shared quiet meals by the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes just letting the stillness fill the space. But Ayana's gaze often drifted toward the horizon. Eli noticed. "You're thinking of going back," he said one evening, his voice even. She didn't deny it. "If my people are still out there, I have to find them." Eli stared at the flames, his jaw tight. Part of him wanted to ask her to stay, selfishly, quietly, but he couldn't. She had her own path, her own wounds to heal. "Then you should go," he said at last. "But you don't have to go alone. I can ride with you." Ayana shook her head gently. "This is something I must do myself." Her eyes softened as she looked at him. "You've done enough for me, more than I can say." That night, they sat outside on the porch under a sky full of stars. The desert air was cool, and the quiet stretched far and wide. Ayana tilted her head back, her face bathed in moonlight. "I used to hate the night," she said. "Too many memories in the dark. But now, it feels different." Eli nodded.
Sometimes, when you've been through fire, the quiet feels like a blessing. They didn't say much more, but the weight of that unspoken gratitude lingered between them. It was a farewell in everything but words. As dawn approached, Ayanna packed the few belongings she had: her bow, her quiver, and the small pouch containing the sacred medallion of her people. She paused at the threshold of the cabin, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "Eli," she said, her voice soft but steady, "thank you for seeing me, for not turning away." He stepped forward, his hand brushing hers for a moment longer than necessary. "You're stronger than anyone ever gave you credit for," he said. "Don't forget that." She gave a faint, almost wistful smile.
Neither should you. When she mounted the horse, the rising sun painted the desert in shades of gold and rose. Eli watched her ride away, his hand resting on the porch rail, the weight of her absence already settling in his chest. But beneath it, there was something else, something lighter. For the first time in years, Eli felt like he'd done something that mattered. The ranch felt different after Ayanna's departure. It wasn't emptier, not exactly, but quieter in a way that carried meaning rather than loneliness. Eli Decker walked the grounds each morning, his limp steady but less burdensome, as though her presence had taken some of the weight of his past with her. The half-burned barn was slowly taking shape again. New beams, cut from the nearby canyon, stood upright, their pale wood catching the morning sun. Eli worked in measured silence, hammering, sawing, rebuilding. There was a rhythm to it that felt almost like prayer, a penance he had long owed himself. When he stopped to rest, he would sometimes glance toward the horizon, half expecting to see a dark braid of hair or the glint of a bow returning from the desert. She hadn't promised when she would come back, only that she would, and somehow he believed her. Days turned into weeks. The garden Ayanna planted began to sprout, tender green shoots pushing through the soil, stubborn and alive despite the arid land. Eli tended it every morning, as if the simple act of watering those plants was a way of keeping her spirit near. One evening, as the sun sank low, Eli stood on the porch with a tin cup of coffee. The sky was ablaze with gold and crimson, the same colors that had once reminded him of the fire that stole everything. But now, for the first time, he saw something different in that light. Not destruction, but renewal. He thought about the man he had been before Ayanna rode into his life. A man content to let the world pass by, buried in memories of war and loss. She had changed that. Or maybe she had reminded him of something he thought was gone, that protecting someone, caring for someone, was what gave life its worth. As the stars appeared, Eli took the leather strap Ayanna had tied around his wrist and held it between his fingers. The beads glimmered faintly in the twilight. It wasn't just a charm. It was a promise of strength, of second chances. A faint breeze rustled the dry grass, and somewhere far off, the cry of an eagle echoed across the hills. Eli closed his eyes, letting the sound settle deep in his chest. It felt like a sign, or maybe just the land's way of telling him he was no longer alone. He thought of Ayanna's words before she left. "Don't forget that you're strong, too." Eli set down the cup and stepped off the porch, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. He walked past the rebuilt fence line, past the garden she had planted, until he reached the ridge that overlooked the wide expanse of desert. The horizon stretched endlessly, glowing under the last light of day. For years it had seemed empty to him, just a reminder of what he'd lost. Now it felt open, full of possibility. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the desert air, watching the shadows stretch and fade. For the first time since his wife and son had died, Eli didn't feel like he was standing in the ruins of his life. He felt like he was standing at the edge of something new.
A whisper of a smile crossed his face as he turned back toward the cabin, his limp steady but no longer heavy with sorrow. As the last rays of sunlight bathed the land, Eli paused at the door, glancing once more at the open sky. The horizon burned with gold and crimson, and for the first time in years, Eli Decker felt the world was wide open again. Out here on the trail, every story leaves dust on your boots and fire in your chest. If this journey stirred something in you, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Ride with us on true Wild West stories, where forgotten echoes of the frontier find their voice again.